Okay, so my opponent argued that the death penalty is a deterrent. Well, the death penalty does not, it's not a deterrent. States without the death penalty have had fewer homicides than states that have the death penalty. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, the murder rate in the death penalty states in 2010 had a 25% higher crime rate than the states without the death penalty. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their data shows that 10 of 12 states without capital punishment have homicide rates below the national average, while half of the states with the death penalty have homicide rates above the national average. In a state-by-state analysis, the Times found that during the last 20 years, the homicide rate in states with the death penalty has been 48% to 101% higher than in states without the death penalty. Also, publicity of crimes increased the crime rates instead of preventing them. Some criminologists claim that they have statistically proven that when an execution is publicized, more murders occur in the day and weeks that follow. And a good example is the Lindbergh kidnapping, as Corinne said. And also, death is one penalty which makes error irreversible, and the chance of error is inescapable when based on human judgment. On the contrary, some defendants insist on execution. They feel it's an act of kindness to them. Life imprisonment is a crueler punishment than the death penalty. So on to my opponent's argument that execution costs more than life in prison without parole. The financial cost of putting people to death, once you consider extra appeals, additional procedures, etc., can be more than the cost of putting a criminal in prison for life. So yeah, the cost of actually executing a person is cheaper, but once you add up all the extra appeals, procedures, judges, everything like that, it's way more money than just keeping a person in prison for life. $2 million per person versus $500,000. That's 4 times as much. The Free Counsel for Defense appeals maximum security on a separate death row whim. Also, in Maryland, a comparison of capital trial costs with and without the death penalty for the year 1979 to 1984 concluded that a death penalty case cost approximately 42% more than a case resulting in a non-death sentence. In 1988 and 1989, the Kansas legislature voted against reinstating the death penalty after it was informed that reintroduction would involve a first-year cost of more than $11 million. Florida, with one of the nation's largest death rows, has estimated the true cost of each execution is approximately $3.2 million, or approximately 6 times the cost of life imprisonment sentence. Also, it's a financial cost to taxpayers. Do we really want to pay for the criminals who did this to them? I mean, I don't. So, carrying out the death sentence costs 2 to 5 times more than keeping the same criminal in prison for the rest of his life. It has to do with the endless appeals, additional required procedures, and legal wrangling that drag the process out. It's not unusual for a prisoner to be on death row for 15 to 20 years. Judges, attorneys, court reporters, clerks, and court facilities all require substantive investment by the taxpayers. So also, my opponent says that about the innocent men and women. So there's always a possibility that innocent men and women are put to death without ever having committed a crime. There will always be failings in the judicial system and conviction system. So since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, 82 inmates have been freed from death row. That's 1 death row inmate found to be wrongfully convicted for every 7 executed. Also, an example of an innocent man being executed and then found innocent after he was executed was the man by the name of Stephen Woods, and he was executed in Texas on September 13, 2011. So in November 2002, Marcus Rhodes stood up in court and took full responsibility for knowingly and intentionally causing the deaths of victims by firing the lethal shot that killed both of the victims. While Rhodes was arrested several months before Stephen and all the evidence pointed to blame at Marcus, Denton County Court tried Stephen first. DNA evidence supported Rhodes' confession that Rhodes was the sole shooter. Both victims' backpacks were found in the trunk of Rhodes' Mercedes, and Rhodes' fingerprints were on all the weapons, and his vehicle was littered with shell casings. Since Rhodes was an avid hunter, The guns were registered under his name and found hidden under his bed at his parents' home in Dallas. A bloody knife carried Rhodes' fingerprints was found in Rhodes' car. All of the physical evidence clearly solidifies that Stephen Woods was not the killer of the two victims. There is no evidence that points out that Stephen anticipated or even knew of these murders in any way, and was a lack of motive confirms this. When Stephen was tried in court, he was accused of firing the fatal shots that killed both victims, despite the fact that there was no physical evidence, and was executed. So let me go back to, this is the new point, that there's inadequate legal representation. So perhaps the most important factor in determining whether a defendant will receive the death penalty is the quality of the representation he or she is provided. Our searches, Justice William O. Douglas states that our one chronicle in vain for the execution of any member of the affluent strata in this society. Eugene Debslaw states that there is something wrong in this country. The judicial nets are so adjusted as to catch the minnows and let the whales slip through. So if you can afford good legal representation, you won't end up on death row. Over 90% of defendants charged with capital crimes are indigent and cannot afford an experienced criminal defense attorney. They are forced to use inexperienced, underpaid, and overworked lawyers. Many capital trials less than a week, hardly enough time to present a good defense. The results are predictable. It is clear that if O.J. Simpson had been poor, he would now be on death row, whether he was innocent or guilty. Also, the American Bar Association published guidelines for a good defense in a death penalty case. First, the attorneys with prior experience working a capital case. Second, there must be 2 attorneys, 1 investigator, 1 mitigation specialist. And third, the fully funded for pay for travels, private eyes, evidence testing, and other things needed to investigate the case. Yet no state meets these standards, and few states pay their state-appointed lawyers well enough to retain competent, effective lawyers. So Corinne stated that the mentally ill patients may be put to death. Many people are simply born with birth defects and their brain that cause them to act a certain way. No amount of drugs, schooling, rehabilitation, or positive reinforcement will change them. Is it fair that someone should be murdered just because they were unlucky enough to be born with a birth defect? Although it is technically unconstitutional to put a mentally ill patient to death, the rules can be vague, and you still need to be able to convince a judge and jury that the defendant is in fact mentally ill.